Good evening and welcome to the Australian National University. My name is Professor Brian Schmidt and I'm the Vice Chancellor here. It's great to see so many people coming out this evening. Before we start our formal proceedings, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands we meet on this evening. Pay my respects to the elders past, present, and emerging of the Ngunnawal Ngambri people. We're meeting here today in Cambry. Cambry has been the meeting place of the First Nations people of this part of the world for millennia. They've been inhabiting this part of the world for more than 20,000 years. And last year, four Indigenous groups, the four Indigenous family members came together and gifted the name Cambry to us. And I know this is Mr. Rudd's first visit here, so I thought I'd give you a little bit of the history of how we've done this. So the Cambry precinct opened in February. It is the heart of our new campus and brings together students, staff, alumni, and the public together. And it allows us to do great events like this. And it's all part of making the National University more accessible to the community, because ultimately, when we do great research, have these great students and staff here, we do best if we then connect to the community at large. So it is right that we are able to meet here at the place there, the nation's capital gets its name, and where people have been meeting for millennia. And it's a true privilege to be able to meet here tonight. So we here at ANU want to create an environment where we can have conversations about the big questions that face Australia, face our region, and face the world. We want to do that so our students can go out and use the knowledge that they've learned here and themselves go out and change the world. And I don't say that lightly. But today we do have an alum taking the stage who has done just that, our speaker, Kevin Rudd. Kevin is an alumnus of ANU, having graduated in 1981 with a Bachelor of Arts in Asian Studies with honors. In 2016, he received an honorary doctorate from ANU for his outstanding leadership and contribution to Australia in international politics and philanthropy. And Kevin, as you know, is a giant of Australian politics. He served as leader of the opposition before the 2007 election, where his party had a landslide victory and he became the 26th Prime Minister of Australia. He is respected for his work in politics, including the signing of the Kyoto Protocol, showing Australia's commitment to reducing the impacts of climate change, and most notably, the 2008 National Apology to the Stolen Generations. In his private capacity, he has also established the Australian National Apology Foundation to continue to promote reconciliation and closing the gap between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians. In the public arena, Kevin has shown global leadership as president of the US-based Asia Society Policy Institute and as chairman of the Independent Commission on Multilateralism. He has also held a number of distinguished positions, including a distinguished fellow at the Chatham House in London, a senior fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School, and visiting professor at Tsinghua University in China. And I know many of you are excited to see him tonight, and maybe you'll hear an update on his self-proclaimed Global Handball King title. I hope you are ready. I would now like to welcome Kevin Rudd to the stage.
Well, g'day. Good to see you all. Thank you, Brian, for the warm introduction. Good to be back at the ANU. And I also acknowledge the first Australians on whose lands we meet and whose cultures we celebrate as the oldest continuing cultures in human history. Well, great to be back here. I vaguely remember what used to be on this site. When I was a snotty-nosed undergraduate here in this fair hall of learning, I think there were some old huts around here, these parts, which were then the ANU gym. And I, for a period of time, was a member of the ANU weightlifting team. I survived a week before I was sacked from the team through an inability to lift anything significant. But I think this was an early part of my formation of my character was around here, and an early understanding of what it meant to fail. That's why I've taken up handball, by the way. My entire life has been spent trying to find a sporting pursuit in which I could excel, and handball, because I'm basically up against primary school kids, is the nearest I can get to it. Tonight, what I'd like to do is talk about alternative visions for Australia's future. And I've been doing a series of these around the country. A couple of nights ago, the University of Queensland, I spoke about what constitutes the elements of a credible national vision. How is it anchored in our sense of our national identity? How is it anchored in our sense of national values? And how is it grounded in our enduring national interests, interests which transcend any particular political administration? And then yesterday at the University of Melbourne, I spoke about alternative visions for Australia's economic future. And what I'd like to do tonight is speak in particular about alternative visions for our future in the region and the world, given China's rise and given America's response to it, and where we find ourselves in the midst of that. I've sought to do so by framing what I describe as 10 major challenges for Australia, washing over our collective shores at present. Large ones, big ones, disruptive ones, of which the topic this evening represents a not insignificant part. But so that you understand the framework I seek to bring to bear on this, let me just run through what I see to be these 10 major disruptions, 10 major challenges, I think, affecting us all. One, the unfolding challenge of the global technology revolution. On the one hand, challenging Australia's future international economic competitiveness, unless we ourselves become major successful innovators in these new generators driving global growth. And on the other hand, also facing the profound employment disruption and economic instability which comes from the new technologies, not least of which is artificial intelligence. Two, the profound challenge of sustaining strong long-term Australian economic growth, given the ageing of our population, static levels of workforce participation, declining levels of economic productivity, as well as a declining bipartisan consensus on long-term migration flows, inadequate infrastructure investment, and as noted above, a global technology innovation revolution that could well leave Australia behind. Three, the clear ravages of climate change, where our national and global actions to mitigate global greenhouse gas emissions are woefully inadequate to prevent unsustainable temperature increases, increasingly frequent extreme weather events with long-term consequences for global foods and water security, the forced migration of peoples, and within Australia itself, the sustainability of the Murray-Darling Basin. Four, the failure to prepare sufficiently for the ageing of our population, both through the absence of fundamental health, hospitals and aged care reform to sustain a high-quality health system for our people, while also managing the costs of the system through, in my judgment, the failure of successive governments to sustain the comprehensive reforms in preventative, primary, acute and post-acute health care, as well as aged care and in digital records, which we introduced back in 2010. Five, a failure to conclude the national reconciliation process with Indigenous Australians through our sustained investment on the one hand in the Closing the Gap strategy and our failure to complete the process of constitutional recognition. For God's sake, let's get on with it. Six, a fragmenting global order driven in part by China's rise, an increasingly isolationist America, a divided Europe, a yawning global leadership deficit in an increasingly G0 world, and the growing danger of return to pre-45 notions of survival of the fittest. Seven, the increasing polarization of our very own region between Chinese and American spheres of geostrategic and economic influence, reducing the freedom of policy manoeuvre for regional states as they seek to secure their own futures. 8, the growing wave of people movements across the world by those escaping political, economic and climate insecurity in their countries of origin, but generating in turn politically and racially charged reactions in the countries they seek to escape to. And this goes in turn to the heart of local political concerns on the deepest questions of collective cultural and political identity. Think of Germany. And 9, the polarisation of our democracies between rich and poor, an increasingly struggling middle class, the failure of much of the traditional politics of the centre-right and the centre-left to deliver sustainable solutions to fundamental problems, compounded, in our case, by a national media split between Murdoch's far right, elements of what I describe as the faux left, and the screaming balkanisation of social media, destroying any real possibility of a political commons through which to discuss reasonable, national, conversational alternatives for our country's future, and bit by bit, therefore, delegitimizing the democracy itself in the eyes of the people. And finally, underpinning all of the above, what I see to be a new gaping chasm in our deepest underlying values. We are at an extraordinary historical transition point. As Christianity declines and almost disappears in the West after 1,700 years of cultural dominance, driven in large part by the sheer weight of its own institutional hypocrisy, only to be replaced by a secularism increasingly uncertain of its own moral compass to guide what is left of the modern-day Enlightenment project, and now facing also an increasingly self-confident new authoritarianism in China, in Russia, and elsewhere, offering alternative modes of political and economic governance. And if that's not enough to make you feel cheery for the evening, our already troubled democratic institutions are faced with an even more fundamental challenge. They are having to deal effectively with all of the above, these complex, unprecedented challenges at scale simultaneously, while at the same time the legitimacy of these very same national political institutions and their international counterparts, those charged with dealing with these challenges, their legitimacy is simultaneously also under challenge. Apart from all that, it's pretty straightforward. I thought it was useful, though, to frame what I see to be these 10 major disruptors, not just for us, but for so many countries around the world. Because whatever the hue and cry of day-to-day political discourse might be, these challenges don't go away. They are material, they are real, and they are washing over our shores. And the question for our country is, what is our response? What is our policy strategy? What is our political strategy? And how is that anchored in our enduring identity as Australians, who we are as a people, the values we share, and the deep underlying national interests which continue into the future? As I said before, my purpose here this evening at the Australian National University is to look specifically at the question of China's rise, America's response to it, and how do we fit in the middle of that with a credible, durable national China strategy for Australia. To begin with, it's worth thinking for a bit what China's own grand strategy is. I always think it's helpful to understand how other people think and why they think that way, because you learn something. And so understanding China's worldview, currently my research project at Oxford University, Xi Jinping's worldview, some two poor guys have to act as my dissertation supervisors, so have pity on them. Imagine putting up with me as a doctoral student. I think it's sort of a fate worse than death. But the core question, the reason I'm doing it, is to try to come to grips with what, in fact, is Xi Jinping's worldview and what, therefore, as a result of that, constitutes China's grand strategy. Let me just run through 7 quick points. Looking at the world from Beijing out. Number 1, priority in grand strategy. Keep the party in power, the Chinese Communist Party. They don't intend to wither away. They intend to be there beyond their centenary in 2021 into the long-term future as a hard Marxist-Leninist party. They've said it, and guess what? They mean it. They obtain power through the barrel of a gun, and if necessary, they will sustain it that way. And the assumption I still see in much of the literature that China will just transform is a view I have never, ever held politically about the culture and the practice of the Chinese Communist Party. Number two, hold the nation together, national unity. And so, Tibet, Xinjiang, Taiwan, Hong Kong. These are elemental to China's self-image and elemental to its strategy for the future. And if we diminish, or fail to understand, I should say, the centrality of this in China's Maslowian hierarchy of needs, then we are failing in our analysis, because it is fundamental. Hence why Taiwan, rarely in our news, is always in Beijing's news. 3, continue to grow the economy. Why? So that people's living standards are improved, and as a consequence of that, go back to priority number 1, sustain the legitimacy of the Chinese Communist Party over time. You fail to grow the economy, you fail to grow living standards, you delegitimize the party. And remember, the party was rancidly delegitimized as a consequence of the Cultural Revolution, which only concluded in 1976. And so the rebuilding task in terms of the party's credibility domestically began at that time with Deng's economic revolution. But for another reason as well, which is to grow China's national capacity. That is, its capacity to act as a strong state at home and abroad in the world. But with a new twist, to do so in a manner which is now environmentally sustainable. And the reason again goes to party legitimacy. Chinese people, like people anywhere in the world, want clean air to breathe, clean water to drink, and food which is not contaminated. And so as a result, this priority number 3 within China's grand strategy is fundamental to the party's future and the country's capacity to act as a significant regional and global actor in the future on the basis of the strength of its economy. 4, looked at it from Beijing, 14 land borders, the greatest number of any country in the world, apart from the Russian Federation, which also has 14. But also in addition to that, at least 6 neighbouring states with whom they have disputed maritime borders. China's objective with its neighbours, therefore, on land and across the sea, is to have as benign relationships as possible with its land neighbours, and ultimately, if it can secure it, as compliant a set of relationships with its neighbours as well, against the benchmark of China's core national interests. China has no interest in territorial invasion. It doesn't. It does have an interest, however, in having compliant neighbours and benign relations with them. Number 5, looking to the east of China's mainland, in what, let's call it, China's maritime periphery, to over time, push the United States back to the first island chain. If you look at the map in your mind of the Japanese archipelago through Taiwan and then through the Philippines archipelago, that's the first island chain. And then over time to the second island chain, which is another line cast further east by about another 1,000 kilometres running through Guam and then down to the eastern side of the Philippines. Against the central organizing principle of that strategic space in China's mind is necessary to secure its ultimate objective of returning Taiwan, even if it requires military force, to the motherland's warm embrace. Number 6, looking west, the territorial periphery, the continental periphery. That is, through initiatives such as the Belt and Road Initiative, to over time convert Eurasia into a new zone of economic opportunity for China itself, a new growth driver. And at the same time, an area which generally will have, in China's mind, more benign attitudes to China itself. All countries from the 5 stands in Central Asia through to the countries of Western Europe, essentially from Nanjing to Rotterdam, and all points in between. And most central of which is to secure a new relationship with the Russian Federation. historically problematic in the Tsarist period, a large acquisition of Chinese territory, and the events prior to the 1917 revolution. Then, ideological condominium with the old Soviet Union for a period until the Sino-Soviet split of the late 50s and early 60s. And then, with the collapse of the Soviet Union in '89, a gradual reaccommodation between Beijing and Moscow so that the disputed border is disputed no longer as a result of Deng's meeting with Gorbachev in '89. And subsequently, and most recently, a fundamental normalization of the Russia-China relationship to the point where that relationship constitutes something which has the hallmarks increasingly of an effective alliance. And finally, in this hierarchy of needs and trying to understand China's and its leadership's grand strategy or worldview on the question of the future of the global rules-based order, not to change it overnight, but to gradually reform it in a manner more compatible with Chinese interests and values over time, and simultaneously to establish institutions beyond both the United Nations framework and the Bretton Woods institutions, which themselves constitute new arrangements for an alternative order if the current order in fact implodes. Hence the BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative, hence the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, hence a number of initiatives along those lines. In summary, therefore, it's useful as we approach our own future in carving out this nation's destiny in our wider region to understand where China is coming from. International reality, however, is the sound of two hands clapping, not just one. And that other hand is Donald Trump's. And it's an interesting process to observe. The Trump administration has declared that 40 years of strategic engagement between the United States and China is now dead. That occurred with the publication of the National Security Strategy of the United States in November-December of 2017. Those of you who have not read the document and are interested in the subject, it's one of those core texts to read. And instead, the Trump administration defined China for the first time as a strategic competitor. However, one of my arguments to you this evening is that declaring China as a strategic competitor of itself does not add up to either a policy or a strategy. It's a declaration. And as I've said recently to audiences in the United States, it reflects an American attitude rather than an American strategy. And therefore, when we look at the internal arrangements of the White House itself and the very different views of the future of the China relationship, we need to be very cautious and clear in this country as to what actually constitutes the likely sustainable elements of American strategy towards China, even under this administration, let alone if there happens to be a Democrat administration which replaces it at the end of next year. For example, on the question of the trade war, the President of the United States has an abiding interest, going back to his time as a candidate, in reducing the trade deficit, hugely, as the President would say, by a huge and bigly number. That's what he would like to do. Those around him, including Lighthizer and the rest, are interested in not just the President's obsession with a mercantilist number, that is, a trade deficit going from that to this, but those around him, including Lighthizer and to some extent Mnuchin, the Secretary of the Treasury, argue that the purpose of these negotiations in the trade war is to bring about structural change in the Chinese economy on the core questions of intellectual property protection, on the core questions of forced technology transfer through joint venture arrangements, and as well to bring about an end to Chinese state subsidy of its firms operating non-competitively and with a great commercial advantage, therefore, on the rest of the world. And there is a group within the administration who seek to do that, with a set of objectives which many American allies fully support, including this country, Australia. And then there's another group which is around people like Navarro and Miller and people like Michael Pillsbury, who argue, in fact, that the function of American strategy now in relation to the People's Republic of China should be to retard China's growth and ultimately to crush its economy by a much wider economic decoupling across technology, across finance, and across the entire economy in order to prevent or at least impede China's further rise. And then you have both Pompeo, the Secretary of State, and Secretary Esper, the new Secretary of Defense, arguing for a broader foreign policy and security policy decoupling from China as well. And a Vice President of the United States, Vice President Pence, who says that the values war, the human rights war with China has only just begun, particularly defending the rights of religious minorities within the People's Republic. And the question which those of us who analysed American strategy constantly ask ourselves is, which of the above is American strategy? And which way will President Trump vote when these things come to a head? And it's a valid question to ask, because if you look at the trade war alone and the periodic intersection of the Huawei debate, that is whether Huawei should be banned or not banned as a 5G carrier in the United States and elsewhere in the world on national security grounds, from time to time we find the President saying, often through tweetland, that maybe as we resolve the bilateral trade dispute, we'll just forget about the Huawei problem. At the same time terrorising the other members of his administration who are heading in precisely the reverse direction. My overall point being, therefore, as we look carefully at the future of Australian policy towards China, is to be as clear as we can about what, in fact, American strategy is, because this is fundamental to understanding the other side of two hands clapping. And more broadly again, what is America's view on the future integrity of its alliances worldwide? You've seen what the President has said about those freeloading Europeans who are unworthy of receiving collective security guarantees from the United States. You've seen the trade wars he's unleashed also against both Japan and Korea, two long-standing American allies. And you see an American economic and trade policy fundamentally at odds with so much of its traditional alliance solidarity. But the broader question is how sustainable, in America's own mind, quite apart from the rest of us and how we view the world, is that long-term alliance structure? And how long will future American administrations, including Trump in particular if he's re-elected, wish to sustain that and fund it militarily? These are questions which Australian grand strategy itself needs to resolve. That is, where does America wish to be in reality, not in declaration, but in its operational strategy against the core questions I've just listed, as opposed to a press release or the occasional venting of spleen. Strategy and spleen are different things, and we need to be clear about that. So let's turn to the third hand clapping. That's ours. Very difficult to construct that as a visual metaphor. I'll leave it to your collective imagination. But for Australia, in looking at all the above, China's grand strategy, where America is up to and evolving its own, given the contending forces at play within the White House and certainly between the White House and any incoming Democrat administration, is for we in Australia to be absolutely clear about what US grand strategy is, whether it will be sustained into the future, and whether we in fact, as Australia, pursuing our own national interests, agree, as a matter of logic, with every element of that grand strategy. This is a process requiring deep policy discipline to run through this exercise rationally. Because if we fail to do so, we will be constructing our own national strategy on flimsy foundations indeed. For Australian strategy, let me therefore argue 5 core principles for the future. The first is this. The first thing that we should do about our own national strategy towards China is form a disciplined conclusion about the current operational content of American strategy and policy and whether we judge that to be sustainable into the future. Number two, for Australia itself, it is imperative that we ourselves have our own national strategy on China. At present, we do not. The most important thing about grand strategy is to actually have one. Again, what I see in this country instead is a series of rolling attitudes about China rather than a coherent policy framework for dealing with China in all the challenges that China represents in terms of our interests and values. So when, for example, I've seen in the last year or so, Malcolm Turnbull stand up and proclaim in appalling Chinese that the Australian people have stood up, and I think, what the hell was that about? Apart from just seeking to be deliberately offensive to the Chinese political class by paraphrasing something Mao said on the birth of the People's Republic on the 1st of October 1949. Or was it in fact an exercise, which I suspect it was, of internal, as it were, coalition politics, and certainly politics between the Conservatives and the Labor Party, to shaft the likes of Senator Destiari? Well, I've been in politics, all's fair in love and war, but on core questions of our long-term national interests, I would say to those who are practitioners today to be very careful about simply incorporating these questions of how we as a country, Australia, manage our long-term relationship with China within the framework of a coherent national strategy, to not simply regard this as a tool to use either in intra or inter-party politics. And when I looked at the likes of young Andrew Hastie, what is it about young Tory politicians who have these rolling set of dreams to become the next Winston Churchill? And therefore standing up and proclaiming that the Chinese have already marched into the Sudetenland. For God's sake, it's a more complex picture than that. But what we see with the likes of Hastie is a very rich and politically appealing political topic to advance his stocks within the Conservative movement within Australia and to further polarise the politics between the Conservative parties and the Australian Labor Party. And then when I look at the periodic grunts of people like Peter Dutton, he's a fellow Queenslander, I can say that, at his Neanderthal best, he's either whacking refugees, whacking asylum seekers, or whacking the Chinese. All again as part of the internal fault lines of Conservative politics. Now, my raising these things here this evening with such an esteemed academic audience, as you all are here at the Australian National University, is not just gratuitous politics. I'm actually making a serious point. This question of our nation's future strategy for dealing with the rise of China, the first time in 250 years that the global economy will be dominated by a non-English speaking, non-Western, non-democratic state, is of itself a serious matter which should not be trivialised, let alone complicated, by turning into a rolling object of domestic retail politics, let alone intra-party politics within the Conservative parties and Conservative political movement. You can be more enthusiastic if you wish. That is principle number 2. Have a strategy. Don't just have an attitude, because attitudes of the type that I have seen vented in this so-called national debate of our future China strategy frankly don't deserve the term policy or strategy. They are attitudes alone. And this, my friends, is too serious a business to trivialise. The third principle I would like to suggest this evening is that it might be useful for the current Australian government to think that there may be things to learn from previous Australian governments. I know it's a radical conservative proposition that you should learn from the past, but I think some of us have been around these racecourses a few times before. I just said this government does not have, to the best of my knowledge, a coherent cabinet-endorsed national strategy for China. My government did. It took us 2 years to develop. And the reason we did so when I was Prime Minister was in 2009, when we began to notice China's increasing activism in the South China Sea. We began to confront some of the challenges arising from Chinese state-owned enterprises wishing to take over long-established, large-scale Australian mining firms. And when we were dealing with rolling human rights concerns with China, and we found that every level of the Australian government was engaging China in a different way, that was why we embarked upon a 2-year-long internal cabinet process between 2009 and 2011. It became our framework for handling this complexity, namely, on the one hand, responding to, through the Australian Defence White Paper of 2009, what the future structure of the Australian Defence Force should be with future contingencies arising from China's rise and its activities in our wider region. And they were there in black and white. They weren't terribly well received in Beijing at the time. Decisions such as rejecting the application to take over Rio Tinto by Chinalco, as well as a range of other decisions, including, based on the best intelligence advice we had nationally, not to have Huawei provide its hardware into the Australian National Broadband Network. We did this within a framework. Simultaneously, however, when explaining these positions to our Chinese counterparts, we did not simply seek to do so gratuitously and unnecessarily offensively. We did them operationally, and then, where necessary, articulated them. But at the same time, we grew the Australia-China relationship in multiple additional dimensions. For example, in the period 2007 to 2013, while all this was going on, to which I've just referred, under our government, our economic relationship grew from strength to strength. The trade volume between our two countries, trade value between our two countries, increased by 115% between 2007 and 2013. I contrast that with the period between 2014 and 2018, when the trade value between our two countries has increased by about half that. What I'm saying is, it provides a framework for dealing with common interests and conflicting interests. And as further evidence of what I would describe as a constructive relationship with Beijing at the time, we collaborated intimately with China in multilateral organizations. The G20, we worked intimately with China on the question of how to re-stimulate the global economy at the time of the crisis in 2008 and 2009. China also welcomed Australia joining the G20 and for it replacing the G7 as the principal institution of global economic governance. Japan did not, by the way. China did. At the same time, as is now well recorded, I had occasional disagreements with our Chinese friends on the question of climate policy at the Copenhagen conference. And as a consequence of that, we had fundamental disagreements, but because we conducted them robustly and clearly, but within the framework of a general strategy, China's evolving approach to climate change action and policy was transformed by the time it got to the Paris conference of 2015, which China then signed and ratified. My argument, therefore, is that such a balanced strategy for dealing with China within the context of the framework of a national China strategy is doable. It's difficult, but it's doable. And that is what I think the current government should consider. 2 final points. The 4th principle of the 5 I wanted to run through is that if you're looking for a conceptual idea which underpinned the national China strategy we evolved in our period in office, it could best be phrased as constructive realism. Realism about where we will always disagree. Alliance with the United States, we're never going to agree on that. Human rights, we're universalists, Chinese are not. We're never going to agree on that. Even aspects of what's now called the foreign interference debate in this country, we're unlikely to agree on that. But beyond that, there are a bunch of questions in which might be difficult to work on, but doable to work on, and to be constructive about that. For example, constructively engaging our Chinese friends on the future of the Belt and Road Initiative, as opposed to simply demonizing it as the definition of ideological evil. I say to the Americans on the BRI, where's your cash to match it? Chinese have put somewhere between $1 and $3 trillion on the table. The Yanks, last time I looked, have put $100 million. That's true. They called it the Build Act. But the bottom line is America in 1944, through the Bretton Woods process, invented the World Bank, invented the regional development banks, the Asian Development Bank, the African Development Bank, the Latin American Development Bank, and it could capitalize these institutions afresh in order to provide roll gold, transparent infrastructure funding mechanisms for the world, and particularly in the target countries of the BRI, which are infrastructure poor and need infrastructure for their futures. And in terms of things that we should be doing on a regular basis to build more political trust between ourselves and China, to engage China in the complexity and the depth of its own domestic and external climate change policy and posture. And even to suggest, and someone will say this is naive in the extreme, how do we possibly engineer with China some joint aid and development projects in various countries in the world as well, rather than simply turning everything into a binary. Constructive realism. Realistic about where we disagree, constructive about where it's hard but doable to find agreement, and constructive as well in those areas where we should be working together. And my final principle, 4 out of 5, is just avoid own goals. Own goals caused by what I describe as a reflex reaction to declaratory statements and press releases and dramatic language used for the purposes of Australian domestic politics, irrespective of the alienation they may cause on the part of your political partners abroad, as opposed to, frankly, having a national strategy in dealing with China which is operational rather than everyday declaratory. China looks at what we do. We seem to be preoccupied with what we say. And I would strongly suggest to those framing Australian-China strategy today that key differentiation is critical. But when I say don't screw up unnecessarily, I mean something broader as well. And I finish on this, the South Pacific. I mean, for God's sake, when we were in office, we had a respectful, collegiate relationship with all countries of the Pacific Island Forum, with the one exception of Fiji, which was then a military dictatorship. And we did that on the basis of two things. We became the advocates for small island state climate change interests in the world, through the Commonwealth, through the United Nations, through the treaty negotiations. I used to sit there with Pacific Island leaders in Copenhagen, taking their positions to the table. Where did 1.5 to 2 degrees centigrade come from? Their advocacy to me to change the language in the Copenhagen Accord to that effect. We built, through policy action, our respect within the region. And on top of that, our development aid allocations increased significantly for each of the states. One simple number. By the time we left office in 2013-14, that financial year, our development assistance allocations to the Pacific Island states, all 14 or 15 of them, was $1.2 billion. By 2015, the incoming Conservative government had reduced that to $640 million. They cut it in half. Now, if you're a recipient state, a small island state of 100,000 people, or 250,000 people, or 500,000 people, this makes a profound difference on the ground in terms of the discontinuity of programs. And when I see Morrison now talking about the great step up, or whatever it's called, the Pacific step up, I looked at the data before coming here this evening. The step up, as of 2018-19, has a proposed allocation to the Pacific Island countries of $1.1 billion. It is less in nominal dollar terms to what it was when I left office. And that's 6 years down the track. And through that, is it any wonder that China has been able to make significant political and strategic inroads into the region? It's just a matter of common sense. I conclude with this. It is not rocket science to develop a national China strategy, one which is anchored in the principles I've just referred to. Anchored in principles of, one, being clear about what the US have as a strategy, in reality, not just in rhetoric. Two, developing intelligently our own national strategy. Three, learning from the one that the previous Australian government had, I'd say publicly tonight to the Cabinet Secretary, hand over our Cabinet papers on this subject. I'd be delighted if of this government reading everything we deliberated on to reach our conclusions. I offer it publicly to them to do. That's my power to do so because I'm the custodian of the Cabinet documents of our period. 4, when we do so, also consider adapting this principle of what I describe as constructive realism. And 5, just learn how to keep your mouth shut from time to time. It really does help. I thank you for your time.
Well, thank you, Kevin. It's great to have you back and being provocative as always. Our audience, I'm sure, will be provocative in their own way, asking interesting questions. And we have some microphones, so please wait for the microphones to reach you so we can all hear. And we've got someone in the back there. I don't know, Pam, do you, let's see, way in the back. Anyone in front here first while we get go into the back? Oh, they're all being so shy. Another one there.
Hello. Mr. Rudd, first of all, thank you for coming here and outlining what I think is a very, very broad strategic view of Australia's position in this relationship or set of relationships going forward. Your final few points, you spoke about political and strategic inroads that China were making in the Pacific region. Do you think that the recent Pacific Islands Forum was a particularly egregious example of us failing to achieve our own strategic goals in that area that has created an opportunity for China to move in? And if so, what, in your view, is a better strategy for us regionally moving forward in the Pacific, one that allows us to work maybe constructively with China in that area?
My observation of Chinese strategy over a long period of time, since I was an undergraduate here, back in the Mesolithic period, was that China doesn't believe in things called vacuums, political vacuums or strategic vacuums. It's not a live concept in classical Chinese strategic thinking. Secondly, the reality on the ground in the South Pacific is that we created such a vacuum both in the development space, but critically in the existential questions of climate change, policy and action. You know, the topography of Kiribati and Tuvalu. These are the island states most likely to go under, together with Nauru. And so therefore, these are not just run-of-the-mill public policy concerns for these countries. These are fundamental and existential. So we created a vacuum under this government by being, as it were, always preoccupied with the internal politics of the Liberal Party on climate change policy, where you still have a large slab of that government who are climate change deniers. And that was what was preferenced here, rather than a series of policy courses which actually gave island states a cause for hope, as we had done earlier. China, observing that, has seen, frankly, a political vacuum emerge. And that's why we've seen what we've seen. In terms of the alternative, it's to the extent that you can rewind history of the last several years, they've got a very limited time to do so. And the steps are not complex. They are as I've just described. Development, climate, and frankly, just a bit of respect helps as well.
Hi, Kevin. That was a great speech. So my question is, the current debate around Australia's China choice is often framed in terms of a policy dilemma, the strategic alliance with the US versus the economic dependence on China. Increasingly, I'm starting to think of it as a policy trilemma. And the third piece of this is, how do we as a country react, and our values, in fact, is that third element. And increasingly, we're seeing with a Lowy Institute survey showing decreasing levels of public trust in China and increasing anxiety towards China. Going forward, suspect this will increase as the debate intensifies, as we hear more and more of these situations, whether it's inside China or here in Australia. So how do we sort of, as a country, address this third element of the incompatibility of values and how that will intensify going into the future?
Yeah, it's a good question. If you are interested in this stuff, on my website, there are the texts of the speeches I gave in Brisbane and Melbourne over the last couple of evenings. The first one deals quite explicitly with this question of the needing to ground any future national strategy by Australia in dealing with China or any other subject in our concept of who we are as a people and the values we hold dear. Because if you do that and basically decapitate it from a public policy process, it'll just come back to bite you fundamentally and make whatever strategy you've embraced unsustainable. So that's why it has to be written into the equation. And you'll see from the text that I've spent some time trying to craft how that is best done. Secondly, in the execution of this, the operationalisation of it, what does it mean? In my judgment, it's this. China, from its own domestic circumstances, post-49, has a view that its practice and policy of authoritarian capitalism or state capitalism suits China's national conditions. And if you listen carefully to what Xi Jinping has said, it's on offer to the rest of the world as well. Not in the sense of fomenting revolution, as China did in the pre-78 period, but as an ideational alternative. My argument's pretty simple. China's domestic arrangements on these questions are ultimately a matter for the Chinese people themselves. We, as Australians, over the course of, frankly, 150 years plus of democratic experience as independent colonies and then as a federation, have a radically different view, coming from radically different traditions. But in the world at large, if you can manage the relationship between the US and China, between ourselves and China, on the basis of what I described before as constructive realism, and avoid a war, a physical war, a shooting match, then the question of who prevails in the world of ideas, in the world at large, should be based on this principle: may the best man win, or woman win. By which I mean, let these ideas float to the surface in terms of which best suits the aspirations of the peoples and countries of the world and which does not. I'm confident in our project as a Liberal Democrat. I am. But the Chinese have a different view. And so, as they would say, let 100 flowers bloom, let 100 schools of thought contend, to which my response is, bring it on. But if we have an America retreating into its shell and simply behaving as a bunch of uber-nationalists themselves, as some have criticised the current administration as being, and no longer offering themselves as a city on a hill, then frankly it becomes a much more complex battle of ideas than it would otherwise have been. And the debate in Europe at present is who holds globally the torch of classical Western liberalism in the future. Will it be what's left of Europe? Or if Trump continues to prevail in the United States, will that become extinguished? But my view is, let the ideas debate and the battle for ideas be joined. I'm still confident ideas of freedom prevail.
Thank you, Mr. Rudd, for enlightening us on the need in Australia to develop a grand strategy. How do you think Australia, as a middle power who's grown very, I guess, wealthy and become the society it has by being an open supporter of a free and open multilateral trading system, how do you think Australia can work with other partners and other middle partner powers in the region, such as South Korea, Japan, Indonesia, and Singapore, to create a coalition of sorts to work effectively together to at least promote a regional stable mechanism?
One of the things we achieved in our period in office was A, the establishment of the G20, and B, our membership of it. This is no small achievement, given where we were before. It was very hard. We were never at the global top table. We are now. That's why Morrison's off in Biarritz at the moment, because of that. But with this opportunity also comes responsibility. You'll see in an opinion piece published in I can't say Fairfax anymore, the Australian Financial Review tomorrow, from me, based on what I said in Melbourne yesterday, which simply says this: the time has come for Australia to play the role of a grown-up in the room, of the G20 room. Now, I'm not so sufficiently deluded as to know that a single Australian voice, therefore, will shape the future of global consensus. But I do know that if you put together 4 or 5 like-mindeds within the G20 framework, countries like the Republic of Korea, countries like Mexico, countries like Indonesia, and other such countries, including the French, including the Germans, and you have within the institutions of global governance sufficient critical mass to preserve consensus around the content and the institutions of liberal international order, it's going to be a hell of a lot better than just sitting back there and saying, engaging privately in, let's call it outrage politics against what elements of what the Trump administration is doing. In other words, grow up, join forces with others, drive the consensus forward. I mean, there should be no back seats in the business of global leadership.
Yes, well, thank you very much, Kevin Rudd. Well, I'm a climate scientist at ANU. I'd like to thank you for your talk, but I even more like to thank you for having been the first Prime Minister anywhere in the world who was elected on the basis of what you called the greatest moral issue of our times. Now, what was the greatest moral issue of our times when you were elected has now become many times more urgent, as you know. We are now talking about survival of nature and of civilization. And everything which I know, and I certainly hope I'm wrong, tells me that this is actually the case and accelerating. And there are even scientists who say that it's not too late. What I wanted to ask you is, what are your hopes and plans of, with your extensive experience in this field, of returning to lead the resistance to what is the greatest calamity which has ever landed on nature and on the human race? Thank you very much.
Well, thank you for that. In the list of what I describe as 10 mega changes at the outset of my remarks this evening, the ravages of climate change and its impacts were prominent among them. In fact, in the top 3. And that's not, for me, a question of ideology, it's a question of scientific reality. Yesterday I attended by video conference a board meeting for the Stockholm Resilience Centre, which is a bunch of 150 humorless Scandinavian scientists who just look at the data and crunch it and come up with extraordinary reports. I commend you to one of our reports entitled Hothouse Earth about 12 months ago, which looks at the compounding effect of what's happening now with global temperature rise. So we're agreed on the science, and we're agreed, therefore, on the urgency of the policy response. I think your question to me was a personal one: what can you do? Well, what I did, apart from joining the world as opposed to hopping off the world, which is what Howard had done, by ratifying Kyoto, was the fact that we now have a renewable energy sector in this country, which is about 20% of total electricity supply, is because we legislated for that. The mandatory renewable energy target legislation, which we put through the House and managed to carry in the Senate by a single vote, has not been able to be repealed yet by this mob. As a consequence, when I was elected, renewable energy was 4% of electricity supply. Now it's 19.6% of electricity supply. That's one thing. The objective was to create a critical mass sufficient for the renewable sector to then compete effectively domestically for the rest of supply. Other measures we took were then repealed, including the carbon price, repealed by the Conservatives. And frankly, it makes my heart bleed that here we are 10 years down the track when we should be 10 years into a carbon price instead of having the revisitation of this primary debate. And I will never forgive the Green Party for joining with the Liberal Party to defeat that legislation for utterly opportunistic reasons.
Yeah.
Now, for the future, those of us in think tanks, for example, what I try and do, and we have done through the Policy Institute I lead in New York, is that we have worked with Chinese, South Korean and Japanese regulators to devise the technical basis on which the 3 emissions trading schemes of Northeast Asia can be linked, and there can be carbon trading among them. Secondly, what we're doing as a think tank is actively supporting policy engagement still by, let's call it, the American resistance and the Chinese government on future climate change action, should there be a change of administration at the end of next year. But beyond that, mate, I'm a single voice and a single person, and I have strut and fret my hour upon the stage and am heard no more in Australian politics. Wasn't that funny?
Unfortunately, we've run out of time. I'm conscious that we have a book signing for those who want to hang around in the...
Buy lots of books.
A book signing out in the lobby. Kevin, it's great to have you back at ANU. That was an absolutely riveting speech you gave. Absolutely topical, and I do hope that we take your advice because it's hard to argue with any of it. Thank you so much. Let's give Kevin Rudd one more round of applause.